They say the heart was still beating when they burned it, that the smoke smelled like iron and fat, that the priest looked away, and the crowd leaned in, not in horror but in fascination. They say his last word was freedom, but no one can say for sure, because by the time the execution ended, there was hardly enough of him left to speak. August 23rd, 1305, Smithfield, London, the day England tried to erase a name from history and accidentally made him immortal. He came through the streets dragged on a wooden frame, tied at the ankles and wrists, his back skinned open by the cobbled stones. Mud in his mouth, blood in his eyes, still alive. That was important. He had to be alive, because this wasn't just punishment, it was theater. Thousands came to watch. Merchants, butchers, priests, nobles in velvet. Children sat on shoulders, too young to understand, too curious to look away. The man on the cart wasn't a king, or a nobleman, or a foreign prince. He was a rebel, a commoner, a man who refused to kneel. His name was William Wallace. But how did we get here? Why was this one man's death worth this much spectacle? Why was England so desperate to make an example of him? To answer that, we have to go back before the flames, before the knife, before the war. Scotland, 1286, a kingdom on the edge of collapse. King Alexander III had fallen from his horse in the dark, his body found cold and broken on the rocks. With no male heir left, the Scottish throne was suddenly empty. Nobles scrambled for power, rival families drew up ancient claims, and into this chaos stepped Edward I of England, the Iron King. Longshanks, he offered help, peace, arbitration, but what came instead were treaties soaked in blood, oaths given at the tip of a sword, and behind every agreement, an English army waiting just across the border. He demanded submission. He got it, from many, but not from all. William Wallace was born sometime around 1270, probably near Paisley, to a minor noble family. Not royalty, not rich, but educated. He could read, write, speak Latin, and more importantly, he could fight. Little is known about his early years. Chroniclers say he was strong, quiet, fierce. Others call him reckless, proud, dangerous. What is clear is this: he hated what England had done to his country, and when they took the one person he loved, he struck back. Her name was Marion Braidfeud. Some say they were married, others say engaged, but the story's always the same. English soldiers tried to capture Wallace. He escaped. In retaliation, they killed her. That was the last time Wallace ran. He killed the English sheriff of Lanark, burned the garrison, and from there began a campaign of guerrilla resistance that would shake the British Isles. He didn't fight like a knight. He fought like a wolf. He struck at night, hit supply lines, burned forts, then vanished into the glens. Word spread. Farmers joined him. So did blacksmiths, outlaws, even former soldiers. Within months, Wallace had turned a band of ragged rebels into a ferocious army. And then came Stirling Bridge. It was September 1297. The English had over 8,000 troops, cavalry, crossbows, armor. Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew Murray, had half that. The English tried to cross the narrow bridge over the River Forth. Wallace waited until half the army had crossed, then attacked. The result was carnage. The bridge became a bottleneck. English soldiers were trapped, slaughtered, drowned under the weight of their own retreat. It was a disaster for Edward, and a legend for Wallace. Scotland roared. Wallace was named Guardian of the Realm, ruling in the name of the absent King John Balliol. For the first time in years, Scotland tasted independence, but it wouldn't last. The next year, Edward struck back. The Battle of Falkirk, 1298. This time, the English came prepared. Long bowmen shattered Wallace's shield formations. His men broke. The nobles abandoned him. Wallace resigned his guardianship and disappeared. For 7 years, he moved like a shadow, ambushing, sabotaging, keeping rebellion alive, even when most had given up. To the English, he was a ghost. To the Scots, he was hope. But every story has a turning point. Every fire, a moment it flickers. In 1305, he was betrayed. Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot, delivered him to the English, and Edward finally had the prize he'd hunted for nearly a decade. Wallace was dragged to London in chains, the streets filled to see him. He wasn't allowed a defense. His trial at Westminster Hall was a performance, not a proceeding. He was accused of treason and answered with a sentence that silenced the court. "I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject." It didn't matter. The sentence was already carved in iron, hanged, drawn, quartered, the most brutal execution in English law, reserved for those who threaten the very soul of the crown. Which brings us back to the morning of August 23rd, to Smithfield, to a man dragged through the streets like refuse, to the crowd that gathered to see a nation's vengeance. They watched him choke on the gallows, watched him cut down, still breathing, watched the knives open his belly, watched his heart torn from his chest, watched it burn, and still, he didn't scream. Some say he prayed. Some say he looked the executioner in the eye. Some say he whispered freedom. None of it can be proven, but one thing is certain. No one who stood in that square ever forgot what they saw. They had meant to kill a man. Instead, they created a legend. But legends are dangerous things. They can't be controlled. They don't stay buried. The fire Edward tried to extinguish would burn again. And Wallace, dismembered, scattered, and silenced, would return in the minds of rebels for generations. Because sometimes in medieval history, the most powerful weapon isn't an army. It's a man who refuses to kneel. There was no trial, not really. Not in the way we understand justice today, with evidence, argument, deliberation, no jury, no defense, no chance. Westminster Hall, August 1305, a cavernous chamber of polished stone and silent judgment. The kind of place where fate doesn't arrive with a gavel, but with a sword. William Wallace stood alone, not in chain, not yet, but surrounded. Lords and officials lined the hall, most of them English, many of them bitter. Some had lost sons at Stirling Bridge. Others had seen their banners dragged through Scottish mud. And now the man responsible stood before them, scarred, gaunt, but unbroken. They wanted him to beg. He didn't. The charge was treason against the crown, a crime that carried a punishment so grotesque it had only ever been reserved for the most dangerous enemies of the state. But Wallace didn't flinch. He raised his voice, rough but steady, and declared, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never the king's subject." Gasps, murmurs, not because they didn't expect defiance, but because it still cut so clean. But the sentence had already been decided. It wasn't about guilt, it was about spectacle. King Edward wanted more than death. He wanted obliteration. Wallace would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Each word a stage in an execution designed not just to end a life, but to tear it apart publicly, physically, and symbolically. The process would begin with hanging, but not until death. Then he would be cut down alive. Then his abdomen opened, his intestines pulled out, and his organs burned before his eyes. Only after that would they cut off his head. Then they would quarter his body, sending each piece to a different city as a warning. And just like that, the sentence was passed. No priest, no last word, only silence and the shuffle of armored feet. What followed was a parade unlike any other. On August 23rd, 1305, Wallace was dragged from Newgate Prison to Smithfield. Not walked, dragged, tied to a wooden hurdle behind a horse. His body bounced and scraped along cobbled streets. Blood trailed behind like a ribbon. At every turn, crowds formed. Some shouted, some wept. Most just stared. They had heard of him for years and the Wolf of the North, the Ghost of the Glens. But now he was a man, flesh, bone, bruised and breathing, and soon not even that. When they reached Smithfield, the square was already full. No market stalls today, no sermons, only the sound of metal tools clinking into place. The scaffold had been built taller than usual, the better to see him from every angle. Not just for the Londoners, but for the messengers sent from cities across England. They were meant to bring the memory home. And at the center of it all, Wallace stood, shirtless, barefoot, ribs visible under his skin, but upright. There was no priest, no confession, only the executioner sharpening blades, and silence. The hanging was first. They placed the noose and hoisted him just high enough to cut off breath. Not enough to break the neck, just enough to bring him close, so close to death. He twisted, gasped. His limbs trembled in the morning light, but they didn't wait for stillness. They cut him down. What came next was the kind of thing medieval crowds didn't easily forget. The executioner took a short, curved knife and sliced open Wallace's abdomen. His intestines were slowly pulled out, hand over hand, and piled at his feet. Still alive, still conscious. Witnesses say he didn't scream, didn't curse, just stared at the crowd, at the smoke rising from the iron brazier where his entrails would soon burn. Then came the heart, torn from his chest, lifted high, and thrown into the fire. This was more than death. This was unmaking. The Crown's final message: this is what happens to those who challenge us. Finally, the axe fell. His head was severed with a single stroke. Some say it twitched in the straw. Others say it smiled. No one knows. But everyone remembers what happened next. His body was chopped into 4 quarters: arms, legs, torso. His head was boiled in pitch and displayed on London Bridge, impaled on a spike. 1 quarter was sent to Newcastle, 1 to Berwick, 1 to Perth, and 1 to Stirling, cities that had once stood with him. Each piece was nailed high where all could see, where every market goer, every traveler, every child would be reminded of the price of rebellion. The goal was to erase him, to fragment the legend, to divide him in death so that his story could not survive whole. But something strange happened. Instead of silence, there were whispers. Instead of fear, songs. Even in English households, the brutality of the execution became something uncomfortable, disturbing. Because in trying to unmake him, they had made something worse. They had made a martyr. Some say the executioner never took another job, that his hands shook for weeks after, that he dreamed of Wallace's eyes. Some say the children who watched that day never slept the same again, that they heard the crack of bone in their dreams. And yet the people kept coming to the bridge to see the head, to wonder what kind of man could endure what Wallace endured and still die with his eyes open. In the months that followed, the Scottish resistance wavered. Leaders squabbled, castles fell, but the memory of Wallace, torn, burned, unbowed, refused to die. He had become more than a rebel. He was now a symbol, and symbols, once born in blood, are nearly impossible to kill. So here's the question. Did the execution work? Did it break Scotland's will? Did it frighten rebels into obedience? Or, did it light a fire that would burn even hotter? Because when a man is cut into pieces and still remembered, not as a warning, but as a legend, you have to wonder, who really won? They thought it was over, that once the body was burned, once the head was blackened by pitch, once the limbs were nailed high over the gates of rebel cities, the name William Wallace would fade like smoke. But they had misunderstood something. Because what Wallace left behind wasn't flesh. It wasn't armies or castles or crowns. What he left behind was a story. And stories, once set loose in blood, do not die easily. In the weeks after his execution, a strange silence settled over Scotland. A kind of national breath being held. The rebellion had been crushed, at least on the surface. Edward's messengers carried fragments of Wallace's corpse across the realm like dark relics, parading them before townsfolk as proof of England's strength. But in private, the whispers grew louder, not of Wallace's defeat, but of his endurance, his defiance, the way he looked death in the eye and refused to break. In monasteries, monks copied fragments of his story into marginal notes. In taverns, ballads were sung under breath. In Highland villages, old women lit candles for the man they tore apart. He had become not a man, but a myth, and myths do not obey kings. Even in England, the execution stirred unease, not because people doubted his guilt, but because the brutality of his death had exposed something deeper, a kind of insecurity, a fear in the heart of the crown itself. Because if you must destroy a man so completely, so publicly, so viciously, then perhaps the threat he posed was never just military. Perhaps it was moral. In the years that followed, Edward I continued his campaigns. He died in 1307, still trying to bring Scotland to heel, but the rebellion did not die with him. In fact, it would rise again, fiercer than before. Robert the Bruce, once Wallace's rival, now took up the mantle. He rallied the Scots once more, and in 1314, less than a decade after Wallace's death, they delivered a crushing blow at Bannockburn. The memory of Wallace marched with them, not in flesh, but in fire, because even though Wallace had never held a crown, never commanded vast armies, never ruled from a throne, his image had become more powerful than all three. In 1320, the Scots would write the Declaration of Arbroath, one of the earliest statements of national self-determination in European history. It didn't name Wallace, but his shadow was there, in every line that declared Scotland would never again be ruled by foreign kings. That freedom was not a privilege granted by monarchs, but a right paid for in blood. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell, but Wallace endured. In the 15th and 16th centuries, chroniclers began to romanticize his life. Blind Harry's The Wallace, written in the late 1400s, turned him into a medieval superhero, slaying English knights by the dozen, outwitting entire armies, sacrificing everything for freedom. Much of it was fiction, but the emotion was real, because Wallace had become more than a man. He was now an idea, one that could be reshaped, reimagined, reawakened, as needed. In the 1800s, during a wave of Scottish nationalism, Wallace's name resurfaced again. Statues were built, poems written. A towering monument at Stirling rose above the valley where he once defeated the English. A sword inside nearly as tall as a man. Visitors still come. They stand in silence before that blade, as if trying to glimpse the hand that once held it. In 1995, Hollywood gave him a new face. Braveheart, blue paint, war cries, Mel Gibson. Much of it historically inaccurate, but the impact undeniable. Wallace, once the butchered ghost of medieval history, now wrote again, on screens, in classrooms, in the minds of millions. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because in turning Wallace into a legend, we may have lost the man. Was he a hero or a killer? Was he a freedom fighter or a fanatic? Did he really die for Scotland or for vengeance? History doesn't give clear answers, It gives fragments, conflicting chronicles, missing pages, and the loudest voices are often the least reliable. What we do know is this: Wallace was brilliant, but also brutal. He ordered executions, burned villages, waged a war without mercy. He was not gentle, he was not clean, but maybe that's the point. Because maybe Wallace didn't die to teach us about nobility. Maybe he died to teach us something darker. That freedom in the medieval world was rarely granted and almost never gentle. It was fought for with steel and fire and silence, with hearts that refused to stop beating even when torn from the body. So what do we make of him now? A martyr? A monster? A myth? Maybe all three. Maybe that's what history does. It doesn't remember people as they were. It remembers them as we need them to be. Wallace was born a man. He died in pieces. But his story, broken, bloody, stitched together by centuries, survived whole. He walks still, not on roads or battlefields, but in questions, in memory, in doubt. And perhaps that is the greatest rebellion of all, to be turned into a warning and become a legend instead.